So I'm happy to introduce Neil Cox here, and we're grateful to have his presentation today.
Carol and I were away for 20 years. We came back and all these young kids were running the town in school. Things happened in 20 years. Mike is just a young man, but pleased with what he's doing. Today I'd like to visit with you about newspapers. The reason I have interest in that is ink runs in some of the blood of my family. They have skipped a generation with me, I think, but as you'll see, my grandfather, a resident of Ephraim much of his life, ran a newspaper, and my father also ran a weekly newspaper not far from here. And so growing up, the smell of ink and the sound of machinery running was a big part of my total experience. And newspapers were important to those early settlers of this valley, contrary to what our friends on the other side of the mountain in Castle Valley say. You've heard the story, haven't you? LDS church leaders came and left a written notice that everyone in Sanpete was to move east, go to Castle Valley. Those who could read went. The rest of us are here. They were literate and they were hungry for news. So much so that during the westward trek, while the Saints were at winter quarters, before they began the Vanguard Company into the Salt Lake Valley, W.W. Phelps was called on a special mission. His mission was, rather than going west, he was to go east to Boston and secure a printing press, and then see that it ended up in the Great Basin. They knew how important the written word is. So it took him about 6 months to get the press back to winter quarters, another 2 years to get it. I don't suppose it was easy to ferry a big heavy press across the rivers and across the plains, but in 1849, the press arrived, and the following year the Deseret News had its birth. They were wise to bring the press and plenty of type. Now, type in those days was single letter type, very laborious to set type that way, but that's the way they did it. But they forgot about paper. Newspapers are huge consumers of paper, and getting paper in the Great Basin was not an easy thing to do. There was a 3-month period, just a year after the Deseret News started, that they had to cease publication because there was no paper. And then a brother, a convert from England, came forth and said, you know, I used to make paper in England, and I think we could use some of the equipment that we use to process sugar, and we could make paper. So they had an experimental try, and I guess they had some success, but it required a lot of scrap paper or rags. And it was hard to come up with the materials they needed to make the paper. So Brigham Young called a brother, his name was Goddard, on a rag mission. His job was to go around the territory and gather rags that could be used in the production of paper. The paper, as I understand it, was kind of thick and crusty and didn't print well, and it was gray in color, but it's the best they had. And they were happy to have some contact with the outside world. Meanwhile, in Manti, they had an earlier start there with newspapers than Ephraim did. The first newspaper in Manti was the Manti Herald. You can see a copy of it here. Only had 15 editions, rightfully so, because it was handwritten. A fellow by the name of Robinson created the newspaper. He was a scribe for Isaac Morley, the patriarch. Must have had a good hand, but after 15 issues, he actually died that year. I don't know if that was the reason. But one thing I noticed about the few issues of the Herald is that the news was primarily local news. The focus was what was going on in Sanpete. And but it met its demise. Then came the Manti Sentinel, later called the Home Sentinel. This is an interesting story. There was a man who came from Sweden. His name was Jan Sjödin. in Swedish, or we'd call him probably Jan Sjödahl. I think he's known better by that. He's actually quite a famous person. He came to St. Pete because he'd been a minister in Sweden. He had a falling out with his church, and he met a missionary from Denmark by the name of Hinsi. We've got to talk to Scott Hinsi about this before he leaves for Argentina. Scott from Manti recently called as a mission president. It's got to be some ancestor of President Hinsi. And anyhow, he met this missionary who got him interested in the gospel, but he didn't join the church. He thought, I'm going to go to America, I'm going to visit Utah and see what those people are about. So he came to Manti, and he did join the church. He was baptized in Manti and started a newspaper. And I don't think you can see this very well, but he had an associate, and you can't read it over. His name was Jakeman. We'll get to him in a minute. The two of them formed this newspaper. Sjödahl didn't stay very long because he got called on a mission to Jaffa, Israel, Palestine. He spent a year preaching. He must have been a great linguist. He knew numerous languages. And later, you'll see his picture pop up. But he's today probably remembered most of all because of a work that was later published 14 years after his death, which is a commentary on the Book of Mormon that's widely published. Along with a fellow named Reynolds found some notes that Sjödahl had made during his lifetime. So quite an interesting life he led. Then there was a short-lived Manti Times reporter, the St. Pete Democrat, or Free Press. And then came the Messenger. I see Suzanne Dean here today. We're going to talk about her too, if that's okay, Suzanne. She's the recipient of the Manti Messenger. But what about people who didn't read English? What did they do? There was an answer. There were numerous foreign language newspapers, but this was the queen, the Beekeveen, which means beehive in Danish. And apparently in Danish it has the same connotation as we think of. It's industry, hard work, beehive. On the header, this says something like dedicated to the Lord, and this is every man will hear the word, that's word, in their own language. And can you make out what this might say over here? Something intended for the Scandinavian people of Utah, something like that, I suspect. And again, Sjödahl shows up. He became the editor of that, and plus a German language newspaper, a Swedish language newspaper, obviously, he was a Swede. I think there was one more, anyhow. He was also the editor of the Millennial Star. He did all kinds of things. He wrote, he translated scripture. He spent his life doing a lot of great things. And a regular contributor to the Beekeveen was CCA Christensen from Manasseh. That's a topic for another day, but Manasseh is located about 3 or 4 miles west of here. And his cabin, I hope you'll take time while you're here in town if you've not seen it before, has been moved and is located between the co-op and the granary down on Main Street with a little sign on it, CCA Christensen. He also apparently, and I couldn't find the years for this, but he, at least for a brief period, was editor of Beekeveen, which was circulated broadly. I don't know how many people here subscribe, but I do know that there were at least 50 in Mount Pleasant who subscribed to this newspaper. So it was a big deal. But Ephraim's newspaper, first newspaper here was created in 1890, and Jakeman, the man who was associated with the Sentinel in Manti earlier, came to Ephraim and started a paper. But it didn't last long. And the paper that he left, the Sentinel, kind of a little caustically maybe wrote this: "We don't know why they used the first name county. I suppose it's only a joke on the county because they didn't feel like the paper represented the county or maybe even the city." At the same time, Jacob was running this newspaper, trying to get a start. He also managed the Nephi Ensign, the newspaper in Nephi. I don't know how. Watching my father and my grandfather work themselves to the bone, I don't know how you could ever consider doing two newspapers. And then the Provo Inquirer, a newspaper in Provo, reported the next year that the Register had passed its to its reward during that summer. But here, coming to town is a stranger. His name's M.F. Murray, and he has some experience with newspaper work. Well, first of all, let's talk about the Register, what we know about it, then when we Murray. One thing I noticed going through the copies of the Register is that they publish 3 times a week. Pretty ambitious. It was a 4-page newspaper, but 3 times a week. And there was strong focus on news from abroad. Now, people had interest in what was going on in the world because they didn't have radio or TV back then. But look at, this was the last issue of the Register, and these were the headlines I found. You see anything local? Lobsters afraid of thunder. I don't know where they were getting their news, but it looks like they were just finding old stuff and copying it and sending it out as news. And there was a hunger, there was an appetite for local news, apparently. The only thing I found in that last issue that resembled local news was a notice that the dentist was leaving for a month. Or you can read into a little advertisement here, buy your hats at the Doria's store, you get oranges for the 24th of July, and there was a circus coming. And it also said the circus had the largest animal on earth. I suspect an elephant, but that's about the only feel you have for what was going on in Ephraim. But you know that lobsters are afraid of thunder. And advertising, the Register too, was primarily out-of-town advertising. Everything in green is from out of town, the black represents local. I was especially interested in this grand excursion to Sterling. Round trip, train trip from Thistle. And they also, a lot of cigar and beer and liquor ads that came from other places. But a surprising number of advertisers from Salt Lake. Suzanne, you don't get many people from the Salt Lake area wanting to advertise here, do you? Yeah. But they took advantage of it. Here's an ad for rubber stamps out of Illinois. Oh, this is interesting. You get 66% profit if you'll sell toilet preparations for this lady in Chicago. And this guy, he advertised weekly in the Register. Your face looks bad. Better get it fixed. And I thought, well, that must be the Ephraim bar. No, this is a guy in Salt Lake who also runs a laundry, apparently, which was common. You know, doing one thing, you can't make it if you don't have multiple things that you produce. Here's one about Acres English Remedy for Consumption. This is a testimonial by a frame maker, picture frame maker in New York, that he drank this stuff and he was cured of TB, and that his children didn't cough anymore, and this guy could hear now. But this is all outside the area advertised. The last issue of the Register seemed to me like a plea for the people to support a paper that wasn't being well supported. I don't know what the circulation was like, but I bet it was low. Claiming that the hometown newspaper was directly building up the town and that they were giving hundreds of free notices in every issue. I didn't see any, but that was their claim. Why me? That was their last issue. Then came Mr. Murray, along with a friend who's a mysterious man. Goddard was his last name. I don't even know his first name, but the two of them came to town and purchased, as they indicated in the first issue of the Enterprise now, that they had leased the register plant for a term of years, but it had no connection whatsoever with the register. They wanted people to know that. And remember, these two were, and Murray did the work. Goddard must have been the financier of the whole thing. As far as I can tell, he apparently wasn't here very much either, but he's being new in the area. It would be a challenge to round up local news, but in the first issue, we'll get that. A little bit of background on Murray. He came from Philadelphia, had worked on a couple of newspapers, and he came to Utah because he thought he would have better health. During his first year, there's a period of time where he wasn't physically able to do the work, but he seems to have rebounded, though he died fairly young. Left his wife here, but stayed here. But here's from the first issue of the Enterprise. Now remember, he's not familiar with the area, so he reports that Peter Jensen went to Melbourne to work this fall. Can you guess where that might be? Melbourne, yeah. He didn't go to Australia. Or the front of the drugstore is newly painted. It's a very tasty job. When you're looking for news. And it wasn't just in this era that strange things appeared as local news. Chester had a heavy rain or a hailstorm. What else is up there? This is sad. An 11-month-old son of the Andersons passed away. Deaths are very numerous in this vicinity. I wonder if he was rethinking his plan to get there. Bishop Glorious had a nice gate built. It's all local. That's front page. So they understood something about the appetite of the people that have local news.
Deaths were numerous in the area.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get out of there.
And I got to point out another one here. This is typical of things that lasted for many years. Ethel and Dora Lowry met, I visited friends with Ephraim. Just something that simple is newsworthy in Sandy. And has been over the years. Well, M.F. Murray ran the paper until 1903, and Fred Jorgensen, then the others that you see there. The average span was about between 5 and 6 years. They didn't last very long. A couple of things during the period of Nephi Christensen. Well, no, let's go back to Oscar Nielsen. They moved the plant, and I don't know where the first plant was, but they moved into the east side of the Bank of Ephraim building, which gave them more space to use. And in 1920, so that would have been during Nephi Christensen's period, they found a new home. With some pictures of that shortly. The business was growing, but modestly and very slowly. Business houses in Ephraim now were advertising. This is just an assortment of advertisers that frequently advertised in the early Enterprise, not the least of which is the co-op. Although I noticed later they didn't advertise very much. Maybe they already had so much business, and there were competitors like the Catholic store and Red Viva. We'll find more about that as we move forward. But local advertising. And there's evidence that some of the local people had to multitask. They had to do more than one thing. So the photographer, Mr. Jensen, also sold Dr. Peter's medicines. Do good where doctors fail to cure. I read some advertisement that said it was for some kind of tonic. They must have believed in those things and used them a lot. But if you drink this kind of tonic, you'll be just like a blacksmith. I guess that means strong, I don't know. But dirty, yeah. So, but in those days, that was common, I guess. Here's Mr. Olson, who's dealing in all kinds of things, but he also manufactures coffins, and he has a complete stock on hand, because remember, there are a lot of deaths. The dentist, the same one that took a month off, will accept wheat in payment for dental work. And E.M. Nelson's bathroom was open Fridays and Saturdays. I don't know what they did the rest of the week. And if you want butter, you go to the drugstore. And the draymen or the people with the big rigs that haul things, it's kind of fun to go through these. By the way, virtually the complete record of all the enterprises, and there are a lot of them, are available on microfilm at the BYU Library in the Religion and Family History section on the second floor. Boy, and it can be addictive, let me warn you. It can be really addictive. Yes?
Copies of both the Messenger and the Ephraim over
Uh-huh. Complete records?
the microfilm.
Yeah, the microfilm. Oh. In the Family History Center here, it's spotted. And there are online too, samples of the work, but there's a big gap. And that gap happens to be during the time that my grandfather was editor. So that's why I'm more evidence of local news, engagement of 3 people, matrimonial fever struck this week, or dry weather. I bet that's been written more than once. World War I casualties and the influenza epidemic. A lot written back then. In 1920, well, before 1920, this picture on the left comes from 1906, and this store, Redi Viva, which in Italian means new life, which kind of sounds like Goodwill or Deseret Industries, but I don't think that's what it was. They sold new things, but I'm curious to know why it was called that. It was a growing enterprise, and they advertised at the bottom of the front page of the Ephraim Enterprise consistently every week for several years. And then, about 1912 or so, McCafferty's store, which also advertised in the Enterprise but on one of the back pages, took over the front page. And then, in one edition, there was a great big half-page ad from Redi Viva saying that they were having a fire sale, basically. And after that, I didn't find any more advertising. So I'm assuming that the business went belly up. Leaving behind a nice building, the Enterprise acquired that building in 1920. You may recognize it. It's located next to the Bishop Storehouse. If you go further north, you'll be at the co-op. It's on the same block as the co-op. And this is a remodeled front. It looks different than this, but you can clearly see that's the same building. And this is the building I knew as the Ephraim Enterprise. Those of you here would feel the same way because there's nobody here that would remember this building. I don't think. Oh, Redi Viva is a possible reason for the name is the state flower of Montana, the bitterroot. The scientific name for that is Luisa Redi Viva. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it. There's a topic to look at. Meanwhile, in 1923, here at Snow College, Wayne B. Hales was the president of the school, and he wrote his annual report that year and recorded in there that an ambitious student by the name of Roscoe Cox had begun editing a monthly student newspaper and had dubbed it the Snowdrift. I think that's a good name, Did the Drift, Snowdrift. And if you look at copies of the Snowdrift today, you'll see that since 1923, it's been continuously produced since it was started. This was my grandfather, Roscoe Cox. He was raised in Fairview and was editor of his high school newspaper, kind of a curious name, NSH, and North Sandy High School. They still call it that? Everybody know?
That's the yearbook.
That's the yearbook now.
Is it? Okay. Well, they kept the name anyhow. And he was assigned to be a journalist during World War I. He went to Europe and spent time there, and then when he returned, was called on a 3.5-year mission to Hawaii. And when he returned, he enrolled at Snow. He was a pretty old freshman. And he met a young lady from Ephraim, Armada Bailey. and they hit it off and married. Both of them have very strong ties to the area. And in early 1925, he left his studies at Snow College, and they began to operate the Ephraim Enterprise for the next 35 years with a 3-year hiatus that we'll talk about here. And 35 years, he exceeded that 5-year average. He was the editor, but my grandmother, Armida, was certainly, I called her the first assistant. She worked hard in the business. It was pretty much a 2-person business. They lived on the upper floor of the building where there was a home of sorts. And the first floor was completely filled with equipment, including a very large newspaper press. Their children included Leslie Eugene, whose wife is here. Where are you, Lynette? Leslie Eugene, Audrey, who's buried in the Ephraim Cemetery. Well, she didn't live here during her adult life. She wanted to come home, as so many people do. This is my grandmother, this is my father, and this is just a stray. I don't know who that is. But she's in the picture. I want to use that picture so you can see that clearly that's the same building. Years later, and the sign behind her says job training. You can see how today the whole front of the building is flat and has a brick facade on it. That was changed during the time that my grandparents did that. Another picture of the family and their living quarters upstairs. In 1939, Grandpa Roscoe, with my grandmother, were called on a mission. He was assigned to be the president of the Hawaiian mission and left Ephraim. He loved the Hawaiian people. He used to chatter in Hawaiian to us. I'm not sure what he was saying, but I think it was good. Actually, it was mentioned we went to Samoa, and the 2 languages are somewhat similar. I do know one of the words that he used to. He said, our son Kurt, who speaks Samoan, he used to say, he talked about the mullet, the sasa mullet. Yeah. I think, beat the rear end. He never did. This is a picture of some of the saints there, and if you look carefully back here, there's Grandma, there's my dad, and then Grandpa's somewhere in there, huddled between all these Hawaiian people. What happened in Hawaii during that time period? Yeah, they were there when Pearl Harbor. Grandpa was on one of the outer islands, I forget which, and left his family behind, and that was a very difficult time for them. Welcome, Jane. Good to have you here. My father was 14 when they left for Hawaii. He grew pretty big. So he's taller than his dad. He'd be 16 or 17 in that picture. When the war broke out, his high school, Roosevelt High School in Honolulu, was closed, and he went into World War II. When he came out of the war, he purchased the Manti Messenger, and so that's how he got into the newspaper. It was blood in the family. Now, running a newspaper back then is very different than what they do today. It's mechanical, not digital at all. It was all mechanical. And a key instrument in the production of newspapers was this machine, the linotype. Good name for it because it produced lines of type. Rather than individual characters, lines of type would be produced. Made out of molten lead. One of my jobs when I was young was keeping all the dross off the molten lead. It was pretty dangerous. It's dark still. And there was a keyboard, something like today's keyboard, and little mats. I've got one right here. It has a V inscribed on it. But a line of type would be produced with these brass mats, then it would be cast with the liquid lead, and the product would be a line of type. It would be lined up, and that's the way the newspaper was produced. Heavy, heavy work. If you wanted to change the font, instead of just going like that, there's this like 75-pound tray of these brass slugs, and you'd have to take one out and put another one in. And plus, you'd have to also pay for that whole thing. So limited funds in those days. Very heavy work. Very heavy work. Then the lines of type were set into a bed like this so that the newspaper would be produced. You can see in the background here a cylinder. This is a cylinder press like the one we had. The type would be self-inked, automatically inked. The paper would come down and would be pressed along the type bed, and that would produce these lines of type that produce the newspaper. That's the way it worked every week. As soon as you finished 1 week, you'd melt all the type down and start all over again. It's pretty hot in the shop. That plus, my dad had an old tube type radio that I think was really hot. It was always hot, especially in the summer. The cylinder press that they had was similar to this, maybe a little bigger than this one. It was later moved from Ephraim to Manti. Both of the newspapers used the same press. When they moved the big press to Manti, that opened up quite a bit of additional space on the lower level of the Enterprise building here in town. My grandparents built a more modern living quarter using a portion of the space there. Still kept a print shop, but without the big press. I remember my father and grandfather standing on a bench like this and hand feeding papers into the cylinder press. They'd come off over here. Then you'd have to reverse and do the other side, do the same thing, all hand fed. And then you have to fold paper. So I was the folding machine. And so I had a specialized instrument that I've kept over the years. This is a piece of bone that is carved out so that I could do 3 folds. I could still do it. I got pretty fast at it. Every 25 copies, you put them aside so you know how many you had. And with a circulation of like 800, 1,000 copies, it took a while to fold papers by hand. That was the way we did it. You don't make a total living by just newspapers. The job printing is an important part of any print business. And a hand-fed press like this, which unlike this one, which is powered by foot, we did have a motor on it, but it looked something like that. And banks of type, specialized type, to be used in printing things like wedding announcements and so forth. That's the kind of environment that I grew up in. Local news included important notice that Laura, age 4, who lives in Salt Lake, will be on Romper Room next week. Everybody be sure to watch. And she didn't live in Ephraim, but they formerly lived in Ephraim. But a lot of people who have lived here still subscribe to the paper. Or the College of Roman is up 7%. We're up to 362 students. Director Floyd Holm announced. People, oh, look at this. People from Ephraim went to a funeral in Cleveland. Oh, Cleveland, Emory County. wasn't Cleveland I was thinking of, sorry. Once in a while there was a big newsworthy event. This was an example of that. In 1958, there was a terrible accident at Fish Lake. It took the lives of 3 local men. Thomas Thompson, Billy Joe Green, and Lamar Seiler were their names. And after things settled, not long after it settled, I was impressed with this little article here. This is not about the accident itself. There's a long, a detailed summary of how everything happened and how they found the bodies. It was just a simple thing, too. Billy Joe Green tripped while standing in a boat and grabbed Roger Sondrup, who had lived here, was from Salt Lake, pulled him into the water, and Roger had hip boots on. They filled with water. But he was able to get back on the boat somehow. But Thompson wasn't, and then Green wasn't. Then Thompson jumped in to try and save him, and I forget how the 19-year-old Siler, anyhow, it was just a tragic event. It took nearly 2 days to recover the bodies. But Ephraim is a grand place to live. And shortly after that, this article appeared. You'd remember some of these people. Dick Bailey, Dick Larson, Kent Thursby, John Daniels, Al Seavey, Reed Nielsen. After a full day's work on Monday, went to Mrs. Siler, who lost her son, and hauled 1,000 bales of hay afterward. And they didn't quite finish, and they were all members of the Ephraim Sportsman Club that Billy Joe Green belonged to. Then later, Boyd Larson, Mont Jacobson, Roger Peterson, all went to the Siler farm and finished the job. That's the way people live here. I remember when we lived here years ago, we were on a septic system, lived outside the city limits, and we had a problem. And it backed up. That's not good. And I didn't know what to do. I looked in the phone book. I didn't see any evidence of people who deal with that kind of thing. And some of you remember Evan Reed or Haley Anderson. They showed up with this, looked like a locomotive. It was this big, gigantic tank that they put on a homemade wagon. And they had a pump that pumped all the air out of the tank so you could pump your septic tank. They just delivered it, and Evan gave me a quick lesson on how to use it. And I thanked him and said, how can I pay you? He said, well, we do this for people, not for friends, not for money. And then I said, but what do I do with it when it's full? He said, I got a potato farm. That's the way they live. That's the way we live here. And we help each other. What a novel idea. Other noteworthy things, Marjorie Armstrong, some of you remember her, married Bill Stringham, had a weenie roast. They made yours. Well, they went swimming too. Or, this one caught my, a real sassy electric storm left in its wake 2 large beef animals lying in it. Reed Christensen, that's H. Reed Christensen. One of the cows belonged to H. Reed Christensen, Hans Reed Christensen, the other one to James Rasmussen. And they didn't know it, but some of the Manasseh farmers coming from the west noticed the animals lying there and notified Mr. Christensen. Made the news. Well, that's pretty unusual, I guess. If you go out to the grocery store today on the south end of town, Kathy Brewer will likely be there to help you, very cheerful. She was Kathy Jensen before she was Kathy Brewer. She fell from a horse and broke her arm. They couldn't find her father because he was making a deal for A&J Chevrolet in North Sanpete. And then they went about 1 o'clock the next morning and they had to go get x-rays. The whole story of a broken arm. Ephraim's a grand place to live. Sometimes my grandfather would slip into non-journalistic jargon. Something dirty to low down, no good, right? And then notice how it ends. So one of the old legionnaires, because they stole the flag or the rope off the flagpole of the Indian, one of the older legionnaires offered to serve on a firing squad and shoot. Others thought he should be hanged from the flagpole and left for the crow's feet. Periodically you get stuff like this. Ephraim's a grand place to live. We don't put up with that kind of stuff. There's another story of there was a prowler in town, and it was in the north end of town, and they actually announced in church that you were supposed to keep your eyes open for a prowler, and they had all these North Ward church people out looking for prowlers on Sunday. I don't know if they ever found it. I think Were you involved with that, Lynette? You weren't in the crowd, I know. I think it's about your area that happened. My own family sometimes made the news. This was my grandmother's sister, who passed away during the influenza epidemic. And she was in New York City performing as an opera singer. She sang at the original dedication of the Noyes Building. It was a great lady. She's buried here in Ephraim, but that was a sad. I remember seeing the telegram that they received informing them of her death. But you don't have to die to make the news. I once, while living in Salt Lake, came to help my Uncle Gene, Paul Hay. Made the news. Or my father, while running the newspaper, ran for in an election, and made the news there. The old advertisements. First thing you notice probably are the prices of things back then. Mary's AG, anybody remember Mary's AG? Wow. Yeah, that was the place to go. Used to go there for peanut butter. My grandparents. Regular advertisers included the several grocery stores in town, Anderson Drug, which Jeff told me the other day. I thought he was third generation, but he claims he's fourth. There was somebody before Cannon Anderson there, so that place has been around a long time. Christensen's was for a long time a department store located on Main Street, and who can forget the Ephraim Co-op? I like this ad, kill the alfalfa weevils. Spare you. Does everybody look like that? Boy, there you go. Or, this is an important regular best in milk products, hand delivered to your door by Wayne Peterson. Where are you, Wayne? Yeah, Wayne Peterson. Give him a hand. How long did you do that, Wayne?
20 years.
20 years. And what time did you get up?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock in the morning. Many of us remember his deliveries, which were only Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so I guess Tuesday, Thursday, he didn't get up at 2. But great memories of a great service. Wayne was really dedicated to that work and good product. Some of you remember the town marshal, Hesper Seepy. He put this little notice in. Look at the ends there. He was serious about unlicensed dogs are liable to be destroyed. Period. In the Snow College Centennial History, produced some years ago now by Ed Christensen, he made the statement that Roscoe Cox became the editor of the Ephraim Enterprise after he left Snow and fought many battles for his alma mater, and certainly that's true. He printed all kinds of stories. Here's one about a dance, a pajama dance. This was a notification that Joe Crane had been appointed the head of the humanities department. There was a fire in one of the dorms. This is Oklahoma. I remember seeing Oklahoma, the musical, as a young boy, and advertisement for that. And then I'm not sure I quite remember this, but Second East ran through the campus, and in order to enlarge the campus, they had to close that road off. So here's part of an editorial Grandpa wrote saying we need to close that road and let snow grow. Of course, that did happen. This, an aside, this young man right here from the 1917 basketball team at Snow was Thorpe B. Isaacson. Remember that name? Grew up to, has so many good students from Snow have gone on to do good things, not just from Snow, but from Sandy. Now, sometimes editors make serious errors. I don't think who wrote that was understanding how that would be proceeded. But you have to be careful what you put in print. Yeah. So what's that got to do with the enterprise? Well, when you set type, there are ample opportunities for error, just like when we keyboard anything. So to make sure that everything that went out from the enterprise was totally correct and appropriate, and before spell checkers, there was a regular routine that my grandparents went through. They would take the type bed and put it on a press, more like this, only probably a little more modern than that, but it's pretty old. I suspect it may have gone clear back to the early days of the enterprise. They print proof copies of each page, and then they'd all stand when they did this. They'd stand face to face, and one would read, and the other one would follow, and between four eyes they would pick up if there were any errors, as they were often learned. One day, Grandma was the operator of the linotype most of the time, so I'm assuming she was probably at the keyboard one day, and they had a story that she was doing. It was a story of a family that had visited relatives out of town. Those are common stories. In this case, the Larson family had visited family members in Whittier, California. Well, Grandma was setting the type, and you know where the W is on the keyboard. It slipped and went down and hit the S. And somehow, it didn't get through the proofing. They must have been tired that night, really. So the newspaper was printed. Grandpa, I hope it's okay to tell the story. But the newspaper was printed, and he didn't think much about it until Sunday when he went to church. And a brother came to him and said, "Boss, where's Shittier, California?" Oh no. That story's never been told publicly until today. But that did happen. In spite of that error, the newspaper, there was still interest on the part of others. Grandpa approached retirement age. My father's health was declining, and so they sold both papers. In 1960, to Larry Staley, who had grown up in the newspaper business. His family had run the Davis County Clipper. And he ran the newspaper until 1972, and then Max Call came and operated until, are these dates right, Suzanne, I hope? And it was during the time of Max and his family running the newspaper that the Messenger and the Enterprise were merged into one county newspaper. First up, the Messenger Enterprise, and two years later, what was called now the Sandview Messenger. It's quite a different newspaper than those early editions. I'm impressed each week as I receive the Messenger, as you probably do, where I see some of the job work that they do, like this very nice brochure from Scandinavian Festival, how far they've come, and how important the written word still is to us. Now, let me just read you something in closing here. When my grandfather sold the business, this was an article he wrote in his last issue. Read this. We do not plan to leave Ephraim. By then, of course, his children are gone, but he and my grandmother are still here. We can think of no place in the world that we would rather live And we have full faith that before long, get this, because I'm seeing fulfillment. This is almost a prophecy. We have full faith that before long, Sanpete will have a new birth of culture and industry that will cause many people to come to the area, many of them former residents, who have not been able to find any place quite as good as Sanpete. And then, every time we take a drink from one of the Ephraim street fountains, when they're on, they're often here, or from our own tap, we utter a silent prayer of thanksgiving for such water. I remember they used to brag about the water, and it was worth bragging about. We have similar feelings about the cool summer nights, the fresh air, the mountains, the schools, the church, and especially the people. He also wrote, Snow College is by far the most important institution in the community and in the area. Try to imagine Ephraim and Sanpete, what it would be like without that school. So I think you see that he did have a great love for this area, as all of you do, or he wouldn't be here. And that's very evident in the 32 years that Ross Seacox ran the Ephraim Enterprise. I'm thankful to come from that stock and from this place. And I like he said, am a good example of one who was raised here, went away for many years, but was happy to return. That was always our plan. I'm glad to be home. Ephraim is a great place to be. Thank you.
To allow Neil to answer any questions. If you have any questions, we'd love to answer those.
Yes.
How many copies were there of the handwritten edition?
You know, I wondered myself, and I hope not too many. Oh, yeah. 15 issues, that's all that was in it. That'd be a good thing to research, but I don't know if we have any record of that. Yes. Yes, thank you. A family from Malatt, Idaho, I believe is where they came from, ran the newspaper. Thank you. That was a serious omission. For the 3 years that the Coxes were in Hawaii, and they functioned very effectively. Lived right in the home and operated the newspaper.
We're your neighbors. That is Roscoe.
Oh, okay. Good to have you here. Well, I'll make room for the next hour. We better find seats for everyone too, it looks like. Oh, Suzanne. Was still there. Yeah. That was brutal stuff. I burned my eye twice, but molten lead. I've got a scar right here. I don't know how my dad trusted me. I was only like 10 years old. Yes. Yeah. It's a great source of history. Glad we have it. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Can we give Neil another round?